They treated their big brindle boxer like an only child for years. Then a surprise baby arrived, and every visitor whispered the same warning. Never trust the big dog near a newborn. On a stormy night, when the baby's breathing turned wrong and the power failed, they finally saw who had been watching that nursery door all along. What he did in that dark hallway melted their fear and their hearts for good. The little brick house on Maple Ridge should have felt settled by late evening. Lamps glowed soft gold. The dishwasher hummed, and the nursery down the hall held its brand new crib. Yet something in the air stayed alert, as if the walls themselves were listening. Lauren eased onto the couch, one hand resting on her still tender middle, and told herself it was only new baby nerves refusing to lie down. In the morning, she found her right boot angled away from the mud tray, toe pointed toward the hallway. She paused, palm on the doorframe, trying to remember if she had left it that way after a grocery run. The carpet showed the faintest pressed oval beside it, a hollow where weight had lingered. She blinked, shook her head, and nudged the boot back with her heel, blaming sleep loss and the way dawn made everything look unsure. Later, as coffee dripped and the radio played low, she noticed a smear on the glass of the back door, just above knee level. A wide arc of cloudy moisture had dried into overlapping half-moons. She wiped it with a dish towel, feeling the faint grit of dried condensation and something else, almost sandy. Outside, the yard lay quiet, frost silvering the deckboards. "Old house?" she murmured, even though the place wasn't that old at all. That afternoon, while the baby napped in his bassinet, Lauren knelt on the living room rug, sorting tiny cloves. A shallow dip had formed in the fibres near the coffee table, an oval depression with a rim where the pile still stood high. She pressed her hand into it and found warmth, just a trace, like someone had just stood up and walked away. The hair on her arms lifted. Then she laughed it off and reached for another onesie. Sound carried strangely at night, somewhere between midnight feeds. She woke to a soft, rhythmic tapping along the hallway, close to the floor. Then a hush. Then another gentle series. It was too light for pipes, too steady for branches. She held her breath and listened until the baby monitor crackled and drew her toward the nursery instead. By the time she checked the hall, only her own heartbeat filled the dim. Her body registered what her mind kept dismissing. When she crossed the threshold into the nursery, a faint draft always brushed her ankles, moving inward from the hall, as though something just ahead of her had stirred the air. Her shoulder muscles tightened, then eased, a cycle she repeated without noticing. Twice she turned sharply, sure she'd glimpse someone slipping away. only to meet the stillness of painted walls. On the third afternoon, she found short, stiff hairs along the baseboard by the rocker, caught in the groove of paint and wood. They curled against her fingertip, darker than the dust around them, and clung to her skin with faint static. She glanced toward the open doorway, pulse ticking faster, then forced herself to drop the hairs into the trash. "We don't have time for ghost stories," she whispered, voice not quite steady. That night, after the last feed, Lauren turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway, listening. The house settled with tiny clicks and sighs. From the dark living room came a soft exhale, a weighty shift on fabric, as though something heavy resettled near the floor. Her fingers hovered over the light switch, then withdrew. She left the hall dim and returned to bed with a tightness in her chest, certain that something in this house was still on watch. Morning sunlight laid a bright stripe across the rug, and in the middle of it lay a scatter of short brindled hairs, more than before. Lauren followed them with her eyes to the gap beside the couch where the fibres were pressed flat. Forming a familiar outline, her mind finally allowed itself to trace. "Moose," she called softly, and a broad, worried face popped up from behind the armrest, eyes already fixed on the nursery door. He had been theirs for years, yet he moved like a stranger in his own rooms now. His big brindle body slipped from rug to hallway with deliberate care, nails barely ticking the wood. He paused at the nursery entrance, head low, chest wide, listening to the faint rustle from inside. Lauren watched him from the kitchen, one hand on a mug, the other hovering in case he pushed further than she was ready for. At first, she told herself he was only curious. He sniffed the laundry basket piled with tiny clothes, then backed away when the bassinet squeaked. When the baby fussed, he flinched, ears flattening, then retreated toward the back door, glancing over his shoulder as if asking for instructions. "Just house noises. Just new smells," she said aloud, willing her tone calm enough to steady them both. Patterns emerged. Every time the front mail slot clanged, he hustled to plant himself between the entryway and the hallway, body broad across the runner. When delivery trucks rumbled past, he stood in the living room, head turned toward the crib, muscles tense. He refused treats if they required stepping away from that invisible line of duty. Lauren laughed nervously, calling him over, but he only came halfway, then slid back into position. Indirect signs multiplied. His water bowl emptied faster, the ceramic ringed with stray hairs. The hollow in the rug deepened, exactly aligned with the arc from couch to nursery. On rainy nights, a faint doggy warmth lingered in the air of the hallway long after the baby had been put down. She wiped nose prints from the lower half of windows, telling herself it was all simply adjustment, nothing more meaningful than that. One afternoon, her sister Megan dropped by, arms full of casseroles. Moose hovered near the kitchen, watching the carrier on the table. When the baby let out a sharp, sudden wail, he stepped forward, blocking Megan's path without a sound. Chest broad, legs braced. "Whoa," Megan said. Startled, Lauren's heart jumped. She snapped her fingers, and he backed away, eyes flicking between the women and the tiny flailing hands. That night, she found him lying crosswise in the nursery doorway, head on his paws, nose an inch from the threshold, but body resolutely outside. The baby's soft breaths rose and fell beyond him. When she came closer, he lifted his head and looked up, then scooted backward to leave the path clear, as if he knew the rule shed never spoken. That space was fragile territory. Her throat tightened around something like gratitude and fear combined. Lying in bed, listening to his slow breathing out in the hall, Lauren stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Are you guarding him or guarding us from you?" The question hung in the dark like a loose thread. Moose shifted once, heavy shoulders rustling the rug, then went still. Eyes, no doubt, turned toward the room where the smallest member of their household slept, oblivious to the tension his presence stirred. Years earlier, the house had felt too big for just two people and one exuberant brindle shadow. Lauren remembered the day they'd met him at the rescue barn on the edge of town, his square head pressed between the slats of a stall door, eyes hopeful and a little too wise. Boxer mix, maybe 3, the volunteer had said, but had barreled into their lives like an overgrown puppy, filling empty corners with noise. Back then, weekends meant muddy hikes and coffee drives. Moose sprawled in the back seat like he owned the upholstery. They joked that he was their practice kid, buying him birthday bandanas and a ridiculous knitted sweater he stoically endured each winter. The living room rug had always been his kingdom, toys strewn like bright landmines. The house settled around the rhythm of his snoring and the thump of his tail against furniture. There had been quieter, darker seasons too, when his weight across her feet felt like the only thing keeping Lauren anchored. Months of appointments with closed doors and too gentle voices had left the couple hollowed out. On the night she came home from yet another disappointing consult, Moose had climbed onto the couch without invitation, laying his square head in her lap until her sobs softened into hiccups. Mark hadn't said a word, just rested his hand on both of them. He had been there for every, almost, decision, every conversation about whether their life might simply stay the 3 of them. They'd rearranged rooms, turning the small front bedroom into an office instead of a nursery, telling themselves they preferred it that way. Moose claimed the doorway as his own, stretching out across the threshold so often that they'd begun to step over him without thinking, as if he were a permanent piece of trim. The town knew him as their only child. At the hardware store, the clerk leaned over the counter to slip him biscuits. At the vet, the techs cooed and teased that he was more spoiled than most toddlers they saw. Holiday cards featured his wide, goofy grin between Lauren and Mark, a Santa hat askew on his head. The running joke, half tender, half wistful, was that they'd probably never have a kid who listened as well as he did. So, when Lauren's long-shot positive test turned into a stubbornly beating heartbeat on the ultrasound screen, joy arrived, tangled with guilt. Moose had sprawled at her feet that evening, unaware of the storm in her chest. Shed watched his chest rise and fall and thought, irrationally, that she was betraying him by wanting someone else to call her mum. Her hand slid along his back, fingers buried in brindle fur. Apology caught behind her teeth. Pregnancy shifted everything. Furniture migrated. Gates appeared. Baby gear crowded the corners he used to fly around. He tried to adapt, shouldering through piles of cardboard, sniffing each new plastic-wrapped object with puzzled snorts. When his favourite chair was moved to make room for a rocking glider, he circled the empty space twice and then sat heavily on the rug, head low, as if waiting for the world to click into place again. Opinions came uninvited. A cashier at the grocery store warned Lauren to never trust a big one around a newborn. Her mother offered printed articles about safety and allergies, her voice tight with concern. Friends hinted that it might be kinder to rehome him before the baby arrived. Each suggestion landed like a stone in Lauren's stomach. She smiled politely, but at night she lay awake, one hand on her belly, the other hooked in Moose's collar. The day they brought their son home, Moose's routine shattered. His people had vanished for 2 days and returned with a bundle that beeped and wailed and carried strange antiseptic smells. His nails clicked frantic patterns on the floor as he paced, torn between rushing in and backing away. Lauren saw all of it in his eyes. Confusion, longing, a hint of fear that his place in their small universe had shifted for good. Now, weeks later, the house was full in a new way, but something remained unresolved. The animal who had been their comfort through barren years hovered at the edges of rooms, watching the tiny newcomer who had arrived to fill a different emptiness. Lauren's heart tugged both directions at once, leaving her suspended between past and present, unsure how to let one love make space for another without losing what had carried them this far. It happened on a grey Tuesday afternoon, when the walls felt too close and the baby wouldn't settle. Lauren paced the living room with him cradled against her shoulder, his cries sharp in her ear. Moose lay near the hallway, head on his paws, eyes following every circuit. Each time she turned back toward the nursery. He inched forward a little, then stopped, torn between habit and something new stirring behind his gaze. When the baby's wails reached a higher, frantic pitch, Moose rose and padded into the hall, stopping just short of the nursery door. He looked back at Lauren, then toward the crib, ears twitching. Instead of retreating when she approached, he stayed, chest broad, muscles tense but still. His nostrils flared as the air filled with sour milk and salt tears. She felt a flicker of panic and trust collide, her free hand hovering near his collar. As she shifted the baby to her other shoulder, the tiny blue sock on his foot slipped free and tumbled to the rug, landing near Moose's toes. The big brindle head dropped, nostrils flaring again. For one suspended heartbeat, Lauren imagined teeth, tugging, some clumsy misstep. Instead, he nudged the sock with the side of his nose, rolling it gently toward her foot, then backed away, eyes never leaving the red-faced bundle in her arms. She exhaled a laugh that sounded almost like a sob. "Good boy," she whispered, surprising herself with the old phrase. His tail gave a single thump against the doorframe, restrained, almost embarrassed. She reached down to brush her fingers along his cheek, feeling the familiar velvet fur under her hand. For the first time since the baby came home, her touch rested there without urgency, acknowledging him as part of this new equation. A few days later, during a lull between feeds, she laid the baby on a blanket on the living room rug, close enough to grab but far enough to give her arms a break. Moose settled on the far edge, paws tucked, eyes fixed. When the baby kicked and cooed, his tiny fist flailed outward, brushing the edge of Moose's front leg. The brindle giant froze, every muscle still, as if the smallest movement might break something sacred. Lauren watched, heart in her throat, as the baby's hand found warm fur again and latched, fingers curling into the loose skin of Moose's chest. The big body remained stone, steady, only his eyes flicking toward Lauren in a silent question. She moved closer, ready to intervene, but the moment held. The baby gurgled and pressed his cheek against that solid flank, a contented sound floating into the lamplight. The room felt suspended, fragile and luminous. From then on, Moose began choosing the rug nearest the baby rather than his old corner by the window. During tummy time, he stretched out parallel, nose level with small socks, breathing slow and deep. When the baby grew frustrated and squawked, Moose's ears twitched, and he would nudge one of his old toys a frayed rope, a rubber ball just close enough that tiny fingers could brush it. The offerings were clumsy, but the intent threaded clearly through them. Even family skeptics noticed. When Lauren's mother stopped by, she paused in the doorway, watching the giant brindle body lying motionless while her grandsons hand-patted his side with uncoordinated enthusiasm. Hez being very good, she admitted, surprise softening her voice. Moose's eyes flicked to the older woman and back to the baby, as if he understood the weight of that small concession. Lauren felt something in her chest unclench by a degree. That evening, as twilight poured through the blinds, Lauren sat on the couch, baby dozing against her chest. Moose sprawled on the rug below. The three of them formed an uneven triangle of breath and warmth. She realized with a start that the strange unease of the first weeks had shifted. Questions remained, but there was now a visible bridge between her first child and her fragile second. Built from socks, nudged back, and stillness held under exploring hands. She went to bed that night, hearing Moose's slow breathing in the hall and the baby's soft hum through the monitor. For the first time, the two rhythms didn't feel like competing claims on her heart. Instead, they wove together into a hesitant, shared lullaby. The future was still uncertain, but a beginning had taken shape on the worn fibres of the living room rug, where a giant had chosen stillness over retreat. Spring broke over Maple Ridge with a run of hot, restless days and sharp evening storms. On one such night, thunder rolled close enough to rattle the picture frames, and the baby startled awake, thin wail cutting through the dim. Lauren rose, bone-tired, but Moose reached the nursery first, his claws silent on the runner, as if had practiced for this. He planted himself beside the crib, body between the window and the small form inside. Lightning flashed, casting his silhouette huge against the wall. Lauren paused in the doorway, an odd shiver running through her. The baby hiccuped mid-cry, eyes wide, tiny fists flailing. Moose's head dipped, sniffing the air. Then he exhaled slowly, his breath puffing against the crib slats. The sound seemed to soothe the child for a heartbeat. Then another crack split the sky, and the crying returned. Louder, rawer. The house felt squeezed between those sounds. Earlier that week, the tension around him had sharpened. At a family dinner, Lauren's brother had watched Moose stand near the high chair, eyes level with the baby's kicking feet. Hez huge next to him, head said. Voice low, but not low enough. All it takes is one mistake. The words lodged in Lauren's chest. That night, Shed dreamed of sudden movement and sirens, waking with her hand clamped around Moose's collar, breath ragged. Under that pressure, she and Mark had started penning Moose behind a baby gate during certain hours, telling themselves it was just a precaution. Moose accepted it without complaint, but his eyes tracked every movement through the slats. When the baby fussed, he paced within his confined space, nails ticking a nervous rhythm. The more careful they tried to be, the more it felt like they were betraying someone, though she couldn't name who. On the night the real storm hit, power flickered once, twice, then surrendered. The house plunged into darkness, save for the weak glow of Mark's phone and the distant green light of the baby monitor. Outside, rain hammered the siding. Lauren felt sweat prickle under her shirt as the nursery filled with heavier air. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then cut off, as if swallowed by the storm's throat. The baby's cries shifted, thinning into something strained, edged with an offbeat rasp that clawed at Lauren's spine. She lifted him, heart pounding, feeling his chest stutter against her palm. Moose, no longer contained by electrical convenience, moved in close, nose pressed near the tiny ribs. He whined once, high and sharp, then turned and shoved his shoulder against Lauren's thigh with unexpected force, pushing her back toward the hallway and the front of the house. "Mark," she shouted, stumbling. In the flickering phone light, she saw Moose dart ahead, then whirl, blocking the narrow hall, then surging forward again, as if trying to drag them somewhere. Mark met them halfway, flashlight beam jittering. He won't stop. Lauren gasped. Something's wrong with the baby's breathing. The conviction in her voice came not from the thin sound in her arms, but from the wild urgency in the brindle eyes at her knees. Minutes later, they were in the truck, wipers frantically clearing sheets of rain. Moose paced in the back seat, harness clipped but taut, whining with each hitch of the baby's breath. At the small emergency clinic on the edge of town, staff rushed them inside. The nurse took one listen and whisked the baby to an oxygen mask. Words like reactive airway and good timing floating back. Lauren stood trembling, Mark's arm around her shoulders. Moose's leash clutched in her hand like a lifeline. After the crisis eased and the baby's breath smoothed under the hiss of treated air, the doctor turned to them, expression serious but kind. "You got here just when you needed to," he said. Another half hour in that humidity and storm pressure. It might have been rough. Lauren swallowed hard, flashing back to the moment in the dark hall when a heavy shoulder had shoved her off balance, insisting she move now. On the drive home, the storm spent. Moose finally lay down, head wedged between the front seats, eyes on the baby's bundled form. Lauren reached back to touch his cheek, fingers sinking into fur still damp from the dash through the rain. "You knew," she whispered, voice shaking. Yet beneath the gratitude, another question coiled. Could she keep living half in, half out with him, gating him off from the very child Head just helped save? They pulled into the driveway under a sky scrubbed clean by lightning. The little house looked smaller, somehow more fragile against the deep, rinsed blue. As they carried their son inside, Moose walked ahead, slowing at the threshold as if waiting for permission. Lauren paused, one foot on the rug, caught at the crossroads between fear and trust. Crisis resolved, but the deeper decision still hanging in the air like the last echo of thunder. In the calm days after the storm, caution returned with a quieter, more insidious voice. Neighbours praised their quick thinking, unaware of the brindled alarm system who had started it all. Her mother, hearing about the clinic visit, nodded gravely and said, "See, you have to be so careful with his lungs, and with that animal around." The words didn't mention Moose's shove in the dark, only the risk he supposedly represented. Gates went back up. Rules were tightened. Moose was allowed close during supervised moments, then ushered away when the baby grew fussy or overtired. He obeyed each cue, but his eyes tracked the little blue pajamaid shape with an intensity that never softened. At night, he lay just beyond the baby's door, separated by wood and metal, muscles taut even in sleep. The house settled, but the tension running through it felt like a wire pulled too tight. One quiet evening, Mark spread a new, thicker rug in the living room, softer for small knees. The baby, now sturdier, sat wobbling in the centre, hands slapping the pile with delighted squeaks. Moose stood at the edge of the baby gate, watching every bounce. Lauren hesitated, then opened the latch. The gate swung inward with a tiny click that sounded louder than the thunder had. Moose stepped through, slow, waiting for some unseen line to be drawn. He approached to within a few feet and stopped, lowering himself onto his belly. Front legs stretched long. The baby squealed and lurched forward, drawn to the broad, warm shape like a magnet. Tiny hands grabbed at fur and loose skin, unsteady body tipping against the solid chest. Moose froze, breath visibly shallow, choosing immobility as carefully as any trained sentinel. Lauren knelt nearby, heart racing, but hands resting loosely on her knees, letting the moment unfold. The baby shifted, leaning his full, small weight into Moose's side. Then, with the clumsy determination of the newly mobile, pulled himself further. In a slow, earnest tumble, he ended up wrapped around Moose from behind, pudgy arms clasped across that deep chest, cheek pressed between shoulder blades. The living room lamp cast both of them in a warm circle, brindle back, rising and falling, blue pajamas bunched, fingers buried in fur. Time stretched. Lauren heard only 2 layers of breathing, one deep and measured, one quick and whispery. Moose flicked his eyes toward her, then back to the baby, choosing stillness again and again. Mark, entering from the kitchen, stopped short at the sight, one hand braced on the doorway. "Would you look at that?" he murmured, voice suddenly thick. They stood witness to a decision neither of them could make for him. Memory snapped into alignment then. The moved boot, the hollow in the rug, the nose smears at every glass barrier between the baby and the outside world, the pacing behind gates, the shove in the storm, the way he always placed his body between their son and any opening door, window, stranger's path. Moose wasn't hovering out of jealousy. He was reorganizing his entire sense of purpose around this small, loud, new life. Lauren felt tears prick as she shifted closer, laying a hand gently on Moose's neck, then on the baby's back. "You two," she whispered, a laugh tangled in the words. "My 2 boys." The tension that had held her spine rigid for months began to unspool, replaced by a deep, surprising calm. She realized that keeping them apart was no longer the safer choice. It was the one that would break something essential in all 3 of them. From that evening forward, the gates came down for good. Rules remained: no unsupervised closed doors, no food from tiny fists, but the assumption shifted from suspicion to trust. Moose's pattern became clear. He was the still point in their small storm of bottles and laundry and sleepless nights, the quiet anchor their son instinctively reached for. The crisis that had begun with a storm ended. Softly, on a rug under lamplight, with a hug that melted everyone watching. Later, after the baby was asleep, Lauren scrolled past photos of that moment on her phone, landing on the one that captured it perfectly. A broad brindle back, a chubby figure in blue pajamas wrapped around it, the warm glow of their living room painting everything in gentle gold. She realized the story shed, been afraid of jealous only child turned threat, had been replaced by another, far truer narrative. A guardian finally given his real assignment. Life on Maple Ridge settled into a pattern that, months earlier, would have felt impossible. Mornings began with the patter of small feet and the thump of a heavy tail against the hallway wall. The baby, now clearly a toddler, would toddle out of his room, hair sticking up, pajama cuffs askew, and aim his unsteady march straight for the brindle form waiting on the living room rug. Moose met him with a low wag and a patient yawn. Their walks became a familiar sight in town. Lauren pushed the stroller down the cracked sidewalks, while Moose kept pace at her side. Leash slack, eyes scanning. When they paused at the park, the toddler insisted on holding the leash with his mittened hand, Moose adjusting his stride to match the tiny, uneven step. Neighbours, who had once raised cautious eyebrows, now waved, smiling at the unlikely pair that moved as if tethered by something stronger than rope. At family gatherings, the old worries resurfaced briefly, only to be disarmed by reality. When her mother saw her grandson lean, laughing, against Moose's shoulder while building block towers, she watched closely, ready to flinch. But the big dog merely sighed and shifted just enough to keep himself braced under the wiggling weight. He really does watch him, doesn't he? Her mother said quietly later, a note of wonder in the concession. Even tension at the edges of their community softened. One afternoon, a delivery driver hurried up the walk, arms full of boxes, and froze when he saw Moose stretched across the threshold as usual. Before Lauren could speak, her son toddled forward, patting Moose's back and chirping. Nice. The word they'd taught him. Moose lifted his head once, then rested it again. The driver's shoulders relaxed. Guess he's the doorman, he joked, and the moment passed without fear. Inside, rituals deepened. Storytime meant the toddler curled into Moose's side while Lauren read from a creased board book, her voice weaving through the rhythmic sound of canine breathing. On hard days, when naps failed and tempers frayed, she would find both of them sprawled in a patch of afternoon sun, the child's hand tangled in collar fabric, Moose's muzzle grey-flecked but peaceful. The sight worked on her frayed nerves better than any deep breathing exercise. At the yearly checkup, their vet leaned back on her rolling stool, watching as the toddler offered Moose a carefully measured treat. Hez mellowed into his job nicely, she said, listening to his steady heart through the stethoscope. Lauren nodded, realizing that the word job fit better than pet now. Moose wasn't just part of the family. He was woven into its daily safety net. His presence as expected and reassuring as the porch light at dusk. Each night ended much as the story had turned that first decisive evening. Lamp glowing, soft rug underfoot, a small boy in worn blue pajamas wrapping his arms around a large brindle chest. Sometimes Moose's eyes slid closed, trusting enough to sleep while hugged. Sometimes he stayed awake, gaze turned toward the front door. Either way, Lauren stood in the doorway, watching the two shapes fuse together, and felt her own restless watchfulness finally ease into something like rest. Years later, the rug had been replaced, but the hollow near the coffee table remained, a worn oval where a large body preferred to rest. The little boy in blue pajamas had stretched into a lanky grade schooler, but each night he still drifted toward that familiar spot, book in hand, dropping down beside the brindle form that had grown whiter around the muzzle. Moose's breathing was slower now, but his eyes still tracked every movement with quiet devotion. On the wall above the couch hung a framed photograph everyone commented on first. A wide living room shot, evening lamp glowing. A big brindle boxer standing rock still while a chubby baby in blue pajamas hugged him tightly from behind. A clever red arrow in the printed version pointed toward tiny hands gripping fur. But the real focus was in the softness of Moose's eyes, the trust folding both figures into one shared silhouette. Sometimes, at family gatherings, someone would ask how they had known He'd be safe with the baby. Lauren never had a tidy answer. She spoke instead of small signs, a moved boot, a stormy night, a gentle nudge of a fallen sock, and of the day on the rug when fear finally gave way to seeing what had been true all along. The story never failed to make at least one listener wipe their eyes. Smiling, Moose aged, as all good guardians do. His steps slowed, his naps lengthened, but his chosen post never changed. He still placed himself between child and door, between playtime chaos and sharp table corners, between bad dreams and the dark hallway beyond. The boy, now old enough to understand more, sometimes lay awake with his hand resting on that warm flank, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall that had anchored his entire life. On an ordinary evening, as the sun bled out over Maple Ridge and porch lights blinked on one by one, Lauren watched her son curl up beside Moose, arms slipped around that familiar chest, face tucked into greying fur. The house finally felt fully at rest. She thought of the years when Shed feared there would never be a child, and then feared the child would displace the animal who had carried her through the waiting. Instead, love had stretched. Her spoiled only child had met the new baby and, in choosing to stand still under that first hug, had melted the whole family into one. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.